This woman doesn't even deserve to clean toilets, Major Cole bellowed deliberately, kicking over Sarah Mitchell's cleaning bucket so the dirty water splashed across her uniform. The entire Fort Bragg base knew her as the pathetic janitor who never fought back. What they didn't know was that those trembling hands had once eliminated high-value targets from over a mile away. They had no idea the woman scrubbing their floors was a ghost who had vanished from the most classified unit in military history. And when the truth finally surfaced, Major Cole would wish he'd never been born. BD stories, viewers, drop your wildest guesses below about Sarah's real identity. Whoever gets closest gets exclusive spoilers for next week's episode. Major Cole slammed his coffee cup down on the mahogany conference table, the sound echoing through the sterile briefing room at Fort Bragg. "This place looks like garbage," he barked, his cold gray eyes scanning the spotless surface that Sarah Mitchell had just finished polishing. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting harsh shadows across his weathered face as he deliberately knocked over a stack of papers. Watching them scatter across the floor, Sarah kept her head down, her shoulders hunched beneath the faded gray custodial uniform that hung loose on her small frame. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to disappear in plain sight. The 6 other officers filing into the room barely glanced at Sarah as she knelt to collect the scattered documents. Their polished boots clicked against the tile floor in perfect rhythm, each man carrying himself with the rigid confidence that came from years of commanding respect through rank and intimidation. Major Cole straightened his uniform jacket, the rows of ribbons and medals catching the light as he prepared to deliver what he clearly considered a masterclass in military hierarchy. "You know what the problem with this country is?" he announced to his audience, his voice dripping with practiced authority. "We've gone soft, started letting feelings override facts, started putting diversity over capability." His eyes locked onto Sarah's bent form as she continued cleaning, her movements steady and methodical, despite the obvious tension radiating from every line of her body. Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, exchanging a quick glance with Lieutenant Harris, but neither man spoke up as Cole continued his tirade. "Women!" He spat the word, letting it leave his mouth like something distasteful. "They belong in kitchens and classrooms, not on battlefields or military bases. But here we are, hiring them to clean our facilities because some bureaucrat in Washington thinks it makes us look progressive." Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the cleaning cloth tighter. But she didn't look up. Cole noticed the subtle reaction and smiled, sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his point to his captive audience. "Hey, cleaning lady," he called out, his tone deliberately condescending. "Yeah, you with the mop. You're moving too slow. A real soldier would have this place spotless by now." The other officers watched in uncomfortable silence as Cole stood up and walked deliberately to the coffee station, where he accidentally knocked over the full pot, sending hot coffee cascading across the floor Sarah had just mopped. The dark liquid spread in a growing puddle, steam rising from the surface as it mixed with the cleaning solution she had carefully applied just minutes earlier. "Oops," Cole said with mock concern, his voice betraying not a hint of genuine remorse. "Looks like you'll need to clean that up too. Better hurry before it stains permanently." Sarah finally looked up, her blue eyes meeting his for just a brief moment, and Cole saw something there that made him pause. Not fear or submission, but a carefully controlled intensity that seemed oddly familiar. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she reached for the mop bucket. But Cole wasn't finished with his demonstration. As Sarah began cleaning up the spilled coffee, he walked over to the weapons display case that dominated one wall of the briefing room. Inside, behind reinforced glass, sat an M4 carbine that had been giving the armory trouble all week, a persistent jamming issue that had frustrated 3 different technicians and forced the cancellation of yesterday's training exercise. Cole unlocked the case with his personal key and hefted the weapon, checking to make sure the safety was engaged before turning back to his audience with a predatory grin. "This is what real power looks like, gentlemen," he announced, running his hand along the rifle's barrel. "Precision engineering, deadly capability, the kind of tool that separates warriors from wannabes." He glanced down at Sarah, who had paused in her cleaning to watch him handle the weapon with obvious unease. "I bet our little custodian here has never even seen a real weapon before. Have you, sweetheart?" Without warning, Cole tossed the rifle toward Sarah's feet, where it landed with a metallic clatter that made everyone in the room flinch. The weapon skidded across the wet floor, coming to rest just inches from where she knelt with her cleaning supplies. "There you go," Cole said with false generosity. "Clean that off, too, while you're at it. And be careful. That's military hardware, not some toy you can afford to break." The other officers watched in growing discomfort as Sarah stared down at the weapon, her body completely still, except for the slight tremor in her hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of boots marching in formation somewhere outside the building. Cole crossed his arms over his chest, clearly enjoying the spectacle he had created and the obvious discomfort of his subordinates. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of simply wiping down the exterior of the rifle as everyone expected, Sarah reached out and picked up the weapon with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere. Her small hands moved over the M4 with practiced ease, her fingers finding the magazine release and ejecting the empty clip with a smooth, economical motion that spoke of muscle memory rather than luck. The officers leaned forward in their chairs, suddenly paying attention, as Sarah's entire demeanor seemed to shift before their eyes. Her shoulders straightened, her breathing became more controlled, and her movements took on a precision that was almost mechanical in its efficiency. She field-stripped the weapon in less than 30 seconds, laying out each component in perfect order on the floor beside her. Cole's confident smile began to fade as Sarah worked, her hands moving with the kind of expertise that could only come from thousands of hours of practice. She located the jammed cartridge that had been plaguing the armory technicians, extracted it with a quick twist of her cleaning rod, and began reassembling the weapon with a speed that left the room in stunned silence. The clicking of metal components fitting together seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere, each sound a testament to skills that no custodial worker should possess. When Sarah finished, she performed a functions check that would have impressed a drill sergeant, testing the action and verifying that every component was working properly before engaging the safety and setting the rifle down with obvious respect for its capabilities. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. As every man in the room tried to process what they had just witnessed, Sarah slowly stood up, her uniform somehow looking less shabby now that she carried herself with proper military bearing, and looked directly at Major Cole for the first time since entering the room. The weapon had a double-feed malfunction caused by a worn extractor spring, she said in a voice that was no longer whisper-quiet, but carried the clear, authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Someone also tampered with the trigger mechanism, probably tried to adjust the pull weight without proper tools. If this rifle had been fired in its previous condition, it could have suffered a catastrophic failure that would have seriously injured or killed the operator. Who had taught Sarah these impossible skills? And why did she know so much about weapon sabotage? Major Cole felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at the perfectly reassembled rifle lying on the floor between them. The confident smirk that had defined his expression just moments earlier vanished completely, replaced by a mixture of confusion and growing anger that made his jaw clench visibly. The other officers in the room seemed frozen in place, their eyes darting between Cole and Sarah, as if watching a tennis match where the rules had suddenly changed mid-game. "That's impossible," Cole said finally, his voice lacking its earlier authority and carrying an edge of desperation that everyone could hear. "You're a custodian. You clean floors and empty trash cans. There's no way you could know anything about military weapons, especially advanced diagnostics and repair procedures that stump our own certified armorers. Sarah remained standing, her posture straight, her hands clasped behind her back in a position that any military observer would immediately recognize as parade rest. Her transformation from invisible cleaning lady to confident technician seemed to have happened in the space of a single breath, leaving everyone struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. "My brother taught me about weapons," she said simply, offering no further explanation as she maintained steady eye contact with Cole. The Major's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage as he realized that his carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired spectacularly in front of his subordinates. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in a way that felt almost physical, and Cole could see in the other officers' faces that they were beginning to view Sarah with something approaching respect. "Your brother?" Cole laughed harshly, the sound containing no trace of genuine amusement. "What is he? Some weekend warrior who plays soldier at the local gun range? Did he teach you about weapons between beer runs and barbecues in your trailer park?" The insults came easily to Cole, a reflexive defense mechanism that had served him well throughout his career whenever he felt his authority being challenged. But even as he spoke, he could see that his words weren't having the desired effect. Sarah didn't flinch or look away, didn't show any of the shame or intimidation that Cole had come to expect from his verbal assaults. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the room. "Sir, perhaps we should continue with the morning briefing," he suggested, his tone carefully neutral as he tried to redirect attention away from the increasingly awkward confrontation. But Cole was too invested in reasserting his dominance to let the matter drop. He had built his entire reputation on his ability to intimidate and control those around him, and having that power challenged by a female custodian in front of his subordinates was more than his ego could tolerate. "No," he said firmly, his voice regaining some of its earlier steel. "I think we need to settle this right now. If this woman thinks she knows something about military hardware, then let's put that knowledge to the test." Cole strode over to the secure storage locker in the corner of the room and began working the combination lock with quick, aggressive movements. Inside the locker was an array of weapons and equipment that represented the cutting edge of modern military technology. Each piece worth more than most people made in a year. He pulled out a disassembled sniper rifle, an advanced weapon system that required specialized training and certification, even for experienced military personnel to operate. The rifle had been taken apart for maintenance and cleaning, its numerous components spread across a foam-lined case in what looked like an impossibly complex puzzle of metal and precision engineering. "This is a real military weapon," Cole announced, setting the case down on the conference table with a heavy thud. "Not some basic infantry rifle that any fool can figure out, but a precision instrument that requires years of specialized training to master." The other officers gathered around the table, their professional interest overriding their discomfort as they examined the sophisticated weapon system. Even dismantled, the rifle commanded respect. Its advanced optics, custom barrel, and specialized components representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in research and development. "I'm betting that your brother never showed you anything like this," Cole continued, his confidence returning as he gestured toward the complex array of parts. "This weapon system is used by the most elite marksmen in the world, soldiers who have dedicated their entire careers to mastering the art of precision shooting. If you can reassemble this rifle correctly in under 5 minutes, I'll personally recommend you for a commendation. But when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to pack up your cleaning supplies and get out of my base permanently." Sarah approached the table slowly, her eyes scanning the disassembled components with the same methodical attention she had shown while cleaning the floors. The other officers watched in fascination as she seemed to catalog each piece, her gaze moving systematically from one component to the next. As if she were reading a familiar book, Cole checked his watch ostentatiously. making sure everyone could see his confidence in the outcome of this impromptu test. "You have 5 minutes starting now," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his own superiority. "And remember, this isn't some toy you can afford to break. If you damage this weapon, the replacement cost will come out of your wages for the next 20 years. But something extraordinary happened the moment Sarah touched the first component. Her entire demeanor shifted again, but this time, the change was even more dramatic than before. Her movements became fluid and precise, her hands working with the kind of muscle memory that spoke of countless hours of practice and training. Where moments earlier she had seemed like a nervous custodian trying to prove herself, she now moved with the confidence of a master craftsman working with familiar tools. The first major assembly, the bolt and firing mechanism, came together in her hands with mechanical precision, each component sliding into place with satisfying clicks that rang out clearly in the silent room. Cole's watch seemed to tick with unusual loudness as Sarah continued working, her pace never hurrying but maintaining a steady rhythm that spoke of deep familiarity with the weapon system. The other officers found themselves leaning forward, involuntarily drawn in by the almost hypnotic precision of her movements. She installed the barrel with a single smooth motion, aligned the scope mounts with practiced ease, and adjusted the trigger mechanism with the kind of finesse that required years of specialized training to develop. By the 3-minute mark, what had been a scattered collection of parts was beginning to look like a complete weapon system again. With 30 seconds remaining on Cole's arbitrary deadline, Sarah made the final connections and performed a complete functions check that would have impressed any certified armorer. She tested the bolt action, verified the scope alignment, and checked the trigger pull with the kind of methodical thoroughness that spoke of military training. When she finished, she stepped back from the table and assumed the same parade rest position she had held earlier, waiting for Cole's inspection with obvious confidence in her work. The Major approached the reassembled rifle with obvious reluctance, his face pale as he realized that his gamble had failed even more spectacularly than the first test. Cole picked up the rifle and began his own inspection, checking each component with the desperate hope of finding some flaw or error that would salvage his authority. But the weapon was perfect, not just correctly assembled, but adjusted and calibrated to specifications that exceeded factory standards. The scope was perfectly aligned, the action was smooth and precise, and every component was properly seated and secured. "This is impossible," Cole whispered, his voice barely audible as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. "You're just a cleaning lady. How could you possibly know how to work with equipment that most soldiers never even see?" Sarah looked directly into Cole's eyes as she delivered her response, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "I served in the Navy's Special Operations Forces," she said simply, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "My call sign was Ghost." The transformation was complete now. Gone was any pretense of being a simple custodian, replaced by the unmistakable bearing of a professional warrior. "And I recognize you too, Major Cole. You were the commanding officer who sent my team into Afghanistan on March 15, 2021. But how could a custodian possess the skills of an elite special operations soldier? And what did Sarah's military service have to do with Major Cole? BD Stories exposes the most incredible hidden identities. Who do you think Sarah really is? The conference room fell into a silence so complete that the sound of breathing seemed amplified, each intake and exhale marking the seconds. As Major Cole processed Sarah's words, the color drained from his face as if someone had opened a valve, leaving his skin with a grayish pallor that made his weathered features look almost corpse-like. "Ghost," he repeated slowly, the name seeming to stick in his throat like something he didn't want to swallow. The other officers in the room exchanged confused glances, clearly recognizing the significance of the call sign, even if they didn't understand the full context. Special operations call signs weren't handed out lightly. They were earned through blood, sweat, and accomplishments that most soldiers could only dream of achieving. Captain Rodriguez was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. The ghost? Who completed the most intensive training program in naval special operations? The first woman to graduate from the Advanced Underwater Demolition course? His questions hung in the air like smoke, each one adding weight to the revelation that was reshaping everyone's understanding of the woman they had dismissed as invisible help just minutes earlier. Sarah nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried the weight of years of grueling training and dangerous missions that had forged her into something far beyond what any of them had imagined possible. I completed my training in 2018 and served with SEAL Team 7 until my discharge 3 years ago. Major Cole's hands began to shake slightly as the implications of Sarah's identity crashed over him like a cold wave. Special operations personnel didn't just disappear into civilian life without leaving traces. And they certainly didn't end up working as custodial staff on military bases unless something had gone seriously wrong. "You said March 15th, 2021, he said carefully, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining control. "You said I was the commanding officer. What exactly are you implying about that mission?" But even as he asked the question, Cole's mind was already racing backward through his memory, searching for details about a deployment that he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Sarah stepped closer to the conference table, her movement deliberate and controlled in a way that made several of the officers instinctively straighten in their chairs. "Operation Desert Falcon," she said, the mission name hitting Cole like a physical blow. "A reconnaissance and intelligence-gathering mission in the Kandahar province. My team was tasked with infiltrating a suspected weapons cache and gathering actionable intelligence on insurgent activities in the region." Her voice remained steady and professional, but there was something underneath the military precision, a current of emotion that spoke of pain carefully held in check. The mission was supposed to be a simple in-and-out operation lasting no more than 72 hours, with minimal risk of enemy contact. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Sarah continued her recitation, each detail delivered with the clinical precision of an after-action report. "My team consisted of 5 operators, including me. The team leader was Petty Officer First Class Benjamin Cole, your younger brother." "Major!" The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and Cole actually staggered backward as if he had been struck. The family resemblance that Sarah had noticed from the first day she started working at the base suddenly made perfect sense, and the guilt that Cole had been carrying for 3 years felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Ben was 26 years old, engaged to be married to his college sweetheart, and planning to leave the service after his enlistment ended to start a family. Cole's breathing became shallow and labored as Sarah painted the picture of the brother he had lost, bringing back memories that he had worked so hard to suppress. "Ben was a good soldier and a better man," Sarah continued, her voice softening slightly as she spoke about her fallen teammate. "He was the kind of leader who would rather take a risk himself than put his people in danger, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and sent care packages to his team members' families during deployments." The other officers listened in stunned silence as Sarah's words brought the dead man to life in their imaginations, making him real and human rather than just another casualty statistic in a long and complicated war. "The intelligence for Operation Desert Falcon came from multiple sources," Sarah continued, her voice regaining its professional edge as she moved into the technical aspects of the mission. "Satellite imagery, human intelligence assets, and intercepted communications all pointed to a significant weapons cache in a compound approximately 15 kilometers southwest of Kandahar City. The initial assessment indicated minimal security presence and a high probability of success with low risk to personnel." Cole's face grew even paler as Sarah recounted details that he remembered all too well, facts that had been burned into his memory during the investigation that followed the mission's catastrophic outcome. But Sarah's expression hardened as she reached the critical part of her story. 24 hours before the mission was scheduled to commence, Ben contacted the command center with concerns about the intelligence package. His advanced reconnaissance had revealed discrepancies between the satellite imagery and the actual conditions on the ground. She paused for a moment, letting the significance of that information sink in before continuing. Ben requested a 48-hour delay to conduct additional surveillance and verify the intelligence before proceeding with the infiltration. His exact words to you, Major Cole, were that the compound appeared to be too quiet, too clean, too convenient. Cole's knees gave out, and he collapsed into the nearest chair as the memory of that conversation came flooding back with crystal clarity. He remembered Ben's voice on the radio, calm and professional, but with an underlying note of concern that should have been a warning sign. He remembered the pressure he had been under from his superiors to show results, to demonstrate that his command could execute complex operations on schedule and within budget. Most of all, he remembered his own voice responding to his brother's concerns with dismissive impatience. "I told him to proceed as planned," Cole whispered, the admission torn from his throat like a confession under torture. "I told him that delays were not acceptable and that the mission timeline was non-negotiable." Sarah's next words fell into the silence like hammer blows, each one driving home the magnitude of Cole's failure. 6 hours after Ben's team entered the compound, they walked into a carefully prepared ambush. The weapons cache was real, but it was also bait, part of an elaborate trap designed to capture or kill American Special Operations personnel. Her voice never wavered, but the pain behind her words was unmistakable to everyone in the room. Ben and 3 other members of our team were killed in the initial contact. The 5th team member survived long enough to be captured, tortured, and executed 3 days later. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Cole's ragged breathing and the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. The magnitude of the tragedy was almost too large to comprehend. 5 elite soldiers dead because of a command decision that prioritized politics over personnel safety. The after-action investigation concluded that the intelligence failure was the result of enemy counterintelligence operations that had been ongoing for several weeks, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the detached tone of an official report. But the investigators never had access to the full context of Ben's final communication with the command center. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew an older model cell phone. Its screen cracked, and its case showing the wear of years of careful handling. "Ben called me during the final moments of the ambush," she said quietly, holding up the device so everyone could see it. "He didn't know that my phone was set to automatically record incoming calls, a security feature I had activated months earlier for operational reasons." The implications of what she was saying hit Cole like a physical blow, and he began to shake his head in denial, even before Sarah continued speaking. Everything he said in those final moments was recorded, including his assessment of what had gone wrong and who was responsible for the intelligence failure. What terrible truth had been revealed in his final moments, and how would it change everything they thought they knew about the mission? Type betrayal if you think there's more to this story than we know. Sarah's finger hovered over the play button on her battered phone for a long moment, the weight of 3 years of grief and anger visible in the slight tremor of her hand. The conference room had become a tomb of silence, with even the distant sounds of military activity outside seeming to fade away, as everyone focused on the small device that held the potential to destroy lives and reputations. Major Cole sat slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, as if he could hide from the truth that was about to emerge from that cracked phone screen. "Before I play this recording," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years deciding whether or not this moment would ever come, "I want you to understand that Ben died believing he had failed his team. He died thinking that he had missed something, made some mistake that led them into that trap." The opening seconds of the recording were filled with the distant sound of gunfire and explosions, a chaotic symphony of combat that made everyone in the room flinch instinctively. Through the noise came Ben Cole's voice, strained and desperate, but still maintaining the disciplined communication protocols that had been drilled into him through years of training. "Ghost, this is Bravo 6. His voice crackled through the phone's small speaker, each word punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire. "We are in contact with a large enemy force. The compound was a trap. Repeat. The compound was a deliberate trap." The sound of his breathing was audible between words, quick and shallow, in the way that indicated he was moving under fire while trying to coordinate his team's response to an impossible situation. Sarah's eyes never left Major Cole's face as Ben's voice continued, watching as each word drove deeper into the Major's conscience, like a blade twisted in an old wound. "The intelligence package was compromised from the beginning," Ben's voice said through a burst of static that suggested he was speaking while rounds were impacting nearby. "This wasn't a failure of reconnaissance or a mistake in analysis. Someone fed us information that was designed to get us killed." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to everyone listening. Special Operations Intelligence didn't just accidentally become compromised. It required deliberate action by someone with access to classified information and the authority to manipulate mission parameters. The gunfire on the recording intensified, and Ben's voice became more urgent as he tried to communicate what he had discovered before it was too late. "Ghost, listen to me carefully because I might not get another chance to say this," he said, his words coming faster now as the tactical situation deteriorated around him. "Major Cole knew about the intelligence problems before we launched. He received a warning from our assets in country 48 hours ago, but he buried the report because the mission had already been promised to the Pentagon brass." Sarah watched Cole's face crumble as his brother's words exposed the truth that he had spent 3 years trying to bury beneath layers of official reports and bureaucratic language. Captain Rodriguez and the other officers in the room listened in horrified silence as Ben's voice continued its posthumous testimony from beyond the grave. The Major was told that delaying this mission would reflect poorly on his command performance and potentially impact his promotion timeline. Ben said, his voice now strained with the effort of speaking while under intense fire. He made a calculation that our lives were worth less than his career advancement, and now my team is paying the price for his ambition. The brutal honesty of Ben's assessment cut through the room like a physical force, leaving everyone struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal that had led to his death. The recording captured the sound of an explosion much closer than the previous ones, and Ben's voice became weaker as he continued his final report. "I tried to convince him to delay the mission, told him that the intelligence didn't match what we were seeing on the ground, but he ordered us to proceed anyway," Ben said, his words becoming more labored as his physical condition deteriorated. He said that questioning orders was not our job, that we were soldiers, and our job was to follow commands regardless of our personal concerns. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she listened to her teammates' final moments, remembering her own frustration at being ordered to provide overwatch support from a position too far away to provide effective assistance when the ambush was sprung. Major Cole finally looked up from his hands, his face streaked with tears that he made no attempt to hide as his brother's voice delivered the final devastating blow. "Tell Sarah that this wasn't her fault," Ben said, his voice barely audible now over the increasing intensity of the firefight. "Tell her that she was right to question the mission parameters, and that I should have listened to her concerns instead of following orders that I knew were wrong." The sound of automatic weapons fire grew closer, and Ben's breathing became increasingly labored as he fought to stay conscious long enough to complete his final message. "Tell my brother that I died knowing the truth about what he did to us, and that I hope someday he finds the courage to be the man I thought he was." The recording ended with the sound of a final explosion, and then silence, leaving the conference room filled with the kind of profound quiet that follows a catastrophe. Captain Rodriguez found his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. While Lieutenant Harris stared at the phone as if it contained some terrible curse that might spread if he looked away. The steady tick of the wall clock seemed to count down the seconds until Cole's complete psychological collapse, each mechanical sound echoing in the oppressive silence that had settled over the room like a burial shroud. Outside, the distant sound of soldiers conducting their morning exercises provided a surreal counterpoint to the destruction happening within these four walls. Their shouted cadences and rhythmic footsteps, a reminder that the military machine continued to function even as one of its officers faced the complete annihilation of everything he had built his identity upon. Cole's face had transformed from pale uncertainty to ash and despair, his features seeming to age years in the span of minutes, as the full weight of his brother's posthumous testimony settled into his consciousness. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as the full weight of his responsibility for his brother's death settled on him like a physical burden. The other officers sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the horror of realizing that they had been witnessing not just a military tragedy, but a profound betrayal of the trust that held their entire profession together. Sarah carefully placed the phone back in her pocket, her movements deliberate and controlled as she fought to maintain her composure in the face of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The official after-action report stated that the intelligence failure was the result of enemy counterintelligence operations beyond our control, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. It made no mention of the warnings that had been ignored or the pressure that had been applied to proceed with a mission that multiple people knew was compromised. She looked directly at Cole, who was still crying openly as he confronted the truth of what he had done. 5 men died because you decided that your career was more important than their lives, and then you let their families believe that their deaths were the result of unavoidable circumstances rather than preventable command failures. Cole tried to speak several times before any words would come, his voice breaking as he attempted to justify actions that he now realized were completely indefensible. I was under enormous pressure from my superiors, he finally managed to say, his words barely audible through his tears. The Pentagon was demanding results, and my commanding officer made it clear that any delays would be seen as a failure of leadership on my part. But even as he spoke, Cole seemed to realize how hollow his words sounded in the face of his brother's recorded testimony. I convinced myself that the intelligence was probably accurate, that Ben was just being overly cautious because it was his first mission as team leader. Sarah's expression hardened as she listened to Cole's attempted justification, her patience for his excuses exhausted by 3 years of carrying the truth alone. You knew the intelligence was compromised because the CIA station chief in Kabul sent you a priority message specifically warning about possible enemy infiltration of local information networks, she said, her voice cutting through Cole's self-pity like a laser. I know this because Ben told me about your conversation with him, and because I spent the last 3 years tracking down everyone who was involved in the mission planning process. The revelation that Sarah had been conducting her own investigation sent a chill through the room, making it clear that this confrontation was not the result of a chance encounter, but the culmination of a carefully planned campaign for justice. I needed to know the truth about what happened to my team, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she revealed the full scope of her 3-year mission. I needed to understand how a routine intelligence-gathering operation could go so catastrophically wrong, and I needed to make sure that the men who died received the justice they deserved. She looked around the room at the other officers, making eye contact with each one as if measuring their character and finding them wanting. Most of all, I needed to look into the eyes of the man who killed my brothers and make sure he understood the full cost of his ambition. What would Sarah do now that the truth had finally been revealed? And how would Major Cole face the consequences of his actions? BD Stories reveals the most unexpected plot twists. What do you think Sarah will do next? The news of Major Cole's disgrace spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in mess halls and official channels that moved with the relentless efficiency of military bureaucracy. Within 72 hours of Sarah's revelation, Cole found himself stripped of his command and confined to quarters pending a full investigation by the Inspector General's office. His once immaculate service record was now under microscopic review, with investigators examining every decision he had made throughout his career for signs of the moral corruption that had led to the deaths of 5 elite soldiers. The base that had once respected his authority now regarded him with a mixture of disgust and pity as word spread about his responsibility for a tragedy that had been officially classified as an unavoidable operational loss. Sarah returned to her custodial duties as if nothing had changed, her movements through the base corridors carrying the same invisible quality that had allowed her to observe and gather information for 3 years. But those who knew the truth could see the subtle differences in her bearing. The way she held her shoulders straighter, the confidence in her stride that spoke of a burden finally lifted. She had accomplished what she set out to do, but the victory felt hollow in a way that she hadn't anticipated. Justice was not the same thing as satisfaction, and the knowledge that Ben and his teammates were still dead left her feeling empty rather than vindicated. The weight of carrying their memory had become such a fundamental part of her identity that she wasn't sure who she was supposed to be now that the truth had finally been revealed. 3 weeks after Cole's arrest, Sarah received an unexpected summons to report to the office of Brigadier General Harrison, the commanding officer of Fort Bragg, and a man whose reputation for integrity was matched only by his intolerance for officers who betrayed the trust placed in them. She had never spoken to the general directly, but she knew that he had been following the investigation closely and had personally ordered the comprehensive review of Cole's service record that was likely to result in a court-martial and possible criminal charges. The general's office was located on the top floor of the base's administrative building, a space that reflected both the power and responsibility of his position through its Spartan furnishings and walls lined with photographs documenting decades of military service. General Harrison was a compact man in his early 60s, his gray hair cut in the regulation style that he had maintained since his days as a young lieutenant, and his weathered face bore the lines that came from years of making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people. He gestured for Sarah to take a seat in one of the leather chairs, positioned in front of his desk, his manner respectful in a way that acknowledged both her service record and her recent actions in exposing Cole's crimes. "Miss Mitchell," he began, using her civilian name but with a tone that suggested he was fully aware of her military background and accomplishments. "I've been reviewing your service record, and I have to say that your decision to leave the Navy represents a significant loss to our special operations community." Sarah remained silent as the general continued, unsure of where the conversation was leading, but prepared for the possibility that her actions might have consequences she hadn't anticipated. "Your performance evaluations were consistently outstanding. Your psychological profiles indicated exceptional stability under stress, and your training scores placed you in the top 5% of all special operations personnel," General Harrison said, reading from a file that Sarah recognized as her complete military service record. "According to your former commanding officers, you were being considered for promotion to senior non-commissioned officer rank and possible selection for advanced leadership training." The general closed the file and looked directly at Sarah, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "I'm offering you the opportunity to return to active duty with a full restoration of rank and privileges," General Harrison said, the words hanging in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. "More specifically, I'm offering you the chance to lead the military's first comprehensive training program for female special operations candidates." The proposal was so unexpected that Sarah found herself speechless for several moments, her mind struggling to process the implications of what the general was suggesting. A return to active duty would mean leaving behind the civilian life she had built, but It would also represent an opportunity to ensure that future generations of female soldiers would have opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out more hesitant than she would have liked. "General, I appreciate the offer, but I have one condition that might make my return to service impossible," she said. Her words carefully chosen to avoid any appearance of insubordination while still making her position clear. General Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the idea that someone in Sarah's position would attempt to negotiate terms with a general officer. "I want Major Cole to serve as my assistant instructor for the program," Sarah said, the words causing the general's expression to shift from intrigue to outright confusion. "I want him to learn what honor actually means by serving under the command of people he once considered inferior." The general's reaction was exactly what Sarah had expected, a mixture of shock, confusion, and concern for her mental state that was clearly visible on his weathered face. "Miss Mitchell, I'm not sure I understand your request," he said carefully, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to question whether the stress of her 3-year investigation had affected her judgment. "Major Cole is facing court-martial proceedings that will likely result in a dishonorable discharge and possible imprisonment. He's not exactly the kind of person we want associated with a prestigious new training program." But Sarah had spent months thinking about this moment, considering not just what justice would look like, but what redemption might require for both herself and the man who had destroyed her team. "General, with respect, revenge is easy," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts that she had been forming for months. "I could have exposed Major Cole's crimes in a way that destroyed him completely, and I would have been justified in doing so. But destroying him wouldn't bring back Ben or the others, and it wouldn't prevent future tragedies caused by officers who prioritize their careers over their responsibilities." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts before continuing, "I want Major Cole to spend the rest of his career learning what it means to serve something larger than himself. I want him to understand that true leadership comes from sacrifice, not from the willingness to sacrifice others." General Harrison listened in fascination as Sarah outlined her vision for Cole's rehabilitation, her words revealing a depth of thought and moral complexity that impressed him despite his reservations about the practical implications of her proposal. "I want him to start at the bottom and work his way up through merit rather than politics," Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident as she spoke. "I want him to learn that the people he once dismissed as inferior are actually the backbone of everything we accomplish in the military. Most importantly, I want him to understand that redemption is possible even for someone who has committed unforgivable acts, but only if they're willing to dedicate their lives to making amends." 6 months later, Sarah stood in her dress uniform at the front of a classroom filled with 24 women who represented the first candidates for the military's expanded Special Operations Training Program. Her insignia reflected her restoration to active duty and promotion to the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer, a position that carried both the authority and responsibility she needed to build something meaningful from the tragedy that had brought her to this point. The women in her class came from diverse backgrounds and possessed varying levels of military experience, but they all shared the determination and courage necessary to succeed in a field that had been traditionally dominated by men. At the back of the classroom, wearing the simple uniform of an instructor trainee with no visible rank insignia, stood David Cole. His face showed the weight of the past 6 months. The court-martial that had resulted in his reduction in rank and formal reprimand, the divorce proceedings initiated by his wife, and the ongoing therapy sessions designed to help him understand the psychological factors that had led to his catastrophic failure of leadership. But more importantly, his face showed the beginnings of something that might eventually become wisdom, the hard-earned understanding that true strength came from serving others rather than dominating them. Sarah concluded her opening lecture by reading from a letter that Ben Cole had written to his fiancée just weeks before his death, his words serving as both inspiration and warning to the women who would follow in his footsteps. Military service is not about proving your worth to people who doubt you, she read, her voice carrying across the silent classroom. It's about developing the strength and courage necessary to protect people who can't protect themselves. And it's about building something larger and more important than any individual ambition or desire. She looked up from the letter and made eye contact with each candidate, seeing in their faces the same determination that had driven her through her own training years earlier. As the sun set over Fort Bragg, Sarah made her way to the base cemetery, where Ben and his teammates were buried beneath simple white headstones that bore their names, ranks, and dates of service. She placed 3 empty shell casings at the base of Ben's grave, a military tradition that honored fallen warriors and symbolized the final shots fired in their memory. 3 birds took flight from a nearby tree as she stood in silent remembrance, their forms disappearing into the gathering darkness as if carrying messages to places beyond her understanding. Has Major Cole truly learned the meaning of honor? And will Sarah's program create a new generation of warriors who understand that strength comes from service rather than domination? Type redemption if you believe people can truly change, or revenge if you think Sarah is still planning something. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help others discover it. And if you believe in supporting powerful storytelling that reveals the extraordinary in the ordinary, consider leaving a small donation to help us bring you more incredible true stories like this one. Until next time, remember, you never know who might be walking among you in disguise. See you in the next story. Thanks for watching BD Stories, where common sense takes a vacation and karma runs the show. Like, comment, and subscribe for your weekly dose of mayhem.